feel paralyzed. Now I know it's over. I see you passing by, hand in hand, with your perfect light. My body, a ghost town, feels like someone cut out my tongue. I didn't know my heart could die this young.
Welcome everyone to our first program of 2022. I'm happy to give this opening on behalf of Framer Framed and Huizinga Lecture, who couldn't be here today. We hope this will be a positive year for all of you, but also a year in which we finally see steps taken to leave a livable world for future generations. For while mass consumption and energy dependence continue, we are faced with the finite nature of raw materials, extreme weather conditions, and loss of biodiversity. It is only right that these issues are becoming of greater concern to more and more people. Increasingly, we see how unthinking our behavior is towards the world around us and towards future generations of life on this planet. This issue is on the agenda today as we will hear a lecture from the cultural historian, archaeologist, and writer David Van Reybrouck on the colonization of the future, living on the brink of climate catastrophe, which was previously delivered in Dutch as the annual Huizinga Lecture. We are glad to have David here today, especially as this lecture fits so well with the current exhibition in Framer Framed. The CICC, or the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, where we are now sitting, was initiated by academic and lawyer Radha D'Souza and visual artist Jonas Stahl. Over the past 2 years, and in close collaboration with the Framer Frame team, they conducted research for this project, which takes the form of a court where states and corporations can be held accountable not only for the here and now, but also for the consequences of their actions on future generations. During the CICC hearings, which are now available online, we heard from experts and activist organizations on the actions of transnational corporations globally and more locally in groups' lived context. We heard from many groups about their worries for their children and their children's children as they have watched the changes in their home ecosystems disrupt their own livelihoods and ways of being. Situated within the realm of art, this climate tribunal has been staged with the hope that it will have actionable influence on judicial systems and corporations and power structures more generally, as they operate in public life and in the face of climate collapse. This potential for change or disruption is Framer Frame's hope as it confronts the issue of climate injustice as a necessary continuation of our longer focus on critically examining the colonial history of the Netherlands. This is duly important for the CICC, our current exhibition, and in the research of David Van Reybrouck, as they expose how the reproduction of colonialist power structures form the root of the climate and ecological crises. Framer Framed and David Van Reybrouck first crossed paths due to his research in Indonesia, where we were happy to host his launch of the 2020 book, Revolusi. Now we meet again on this new research project which he has sunk his teeth into, namely the consequences of climate change for future generations. We are pleased that he is excited to give this lecture here at Framer Framed. As the original Huizinga Lecture was delivered in Dutch, we received many requests and saw the value of hosting David's lecture in English to open access to an international audience. We have been able to realize this with thanks to the enthusiastic support of David and the work of translator Susan Ritter. We are very happy to present this lecture and facilitate a Q&A afterwards, guided by Meta Knol, who is a former Frame of Frame board member and co-initiator of the Ministry of the Future. We wish you a very interesting lecture and hope to welcome you back to Frame of Frame soon. And with that, I will turn it over to David.
Thank you, Ashley, for these very kind words, and good afternoon, dear friends, at this talk. By the end of this talk, an estimated 6 to 7 species will be extinct. A tropical salamander, a shiny beetle, an inconspicuous lichen, a bird, a fern, a fish, it could be anything really. Having existed for thousands or even millions of years, they will not survive the next hour and will irrevocably disappear from the face of the earth. At midnight, it could be as many as 50 species. By this time tomorrow, we'll have lost about 150 species. And a year from now, we could be looking up at a total of 55,000 extinct species. And it won't stop there. The number will keep rising relentlessly because we are in the middle of the 6th major extinction wave our planet has known. And this one, it's the first though that's been caused by human activity. The previous wave took place some 65 million years ago when a meteorite wiped out the dinosaurs and some of the fossils you see behind me here in this beautiful art installation by Jonas Stahl. But up to 55,000 species a year. This figure is not just an apocalyptic vision of a few ecological fundamentalists, but it's an estimate from the International Convention on Biological Diversity, a multilateral treaty between 196 countries. The IBPES, the UN platform on biodiversity, has calculated that of the 8 million living species, 1 million are at risk of extinction within one or just a few generations. And that is a conservative estimate. At the Mauna Loa Observatory, a scientific research station situated 3,400 meters above sea level in Hawaii, a carbon concentration of 420 parts per million, or ppm, was measured in April last year. 420 ppm. This figure doesn't mean much to most people, but it was probably the most important news of the year. Imagine our atmosphere as something like a swimming pool filled with 1 million dark and light blue balls. These are the oxygen and nitrogen molecules. And within that swimming pool, you can also see a few bright red balls floating around in this blue mass. There aren't that many of them, just a few hundred, but they are very hot and they stay hot for a very long time, thus heating up the rest of the pool. These are the CO2 molecules, the carbon molecules. Now 420 red balls to 1 million blue ones is an alarmingly high ratio. Mauna Loa is an inhospitable volcano, a sloping, beautiful rocky moonscape overlooking the Pacific. It is also the place where since March 1958 daily observations of the atmosphere have been made, the longest series on record on Earth. 63 years ago, when observations began, carbon levels were only 315 parts per million. Things have moved incredibly fast, from 315 to 420 red balls in less than a lifetime. That is a huge increase if you realize that for the last 800,000 years, with all those harsh ice ages and warmer periods in between, the number fluctuated between 170 ppm and no more than 300. And now we're reaching 420. The major IPCC report that was published last August, based on more than 14,000 scientific publications, left no room for doubt. The Earth is warming up rapidly, and humanity is the cause of it. Glaciers and polar ice caps are smaller than they have been for thousands of years. Sea levels haven't risen that fast and that much in 3,000 years, and the carbon concentration is even the highest in 2 million years. If we don't change our policies, the planet will have warmed up by 4 to 5 degrees by the end of this century, while we have to stay below 1.5 degrees to avoid dangerous global warming. If temperatures rise more than that, risky tipping points may be reached, which will trigger irreversible, self-perpetuating processes. The thawing of the permafrost in Siberia, for instance, may release huge amounts of methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, causing global warming to suddenly accelerate. And in turn, this will release even more methane, which will make parts of the planet uninhabitable within a very short time span. Another tipping point may be caused by the continued melting of the North Pole. And this reduces white, sunlight-reflecting sea ice to dark, light-absorbing sea water, and will result in a decrease in the reflection of sunlight. As a result, the warm Atlantic current that regulates our weather system may weaken or even stop. Land ice in Greenland, at the South Pole, in the Himalayas, may also expand at a much faster rate than expected. This may go on thawing, which could lead to a large sea level increase, as much as 1.2 meters by 2100, according to the latest analysis of the Dutch National Weather Service, the KNMI. Now, it might surprise you that I start to lecture in a cultural institution as framed with a reference to the condition of the natural world, but I feel confident in doing so in this exhibition and in this time frame. Because in Europe, we stand on the threshold of a global climate crisis that will soon affect large parts of life on Earth, or even make it impossible. We are probably on the eve of a great deal of pain, death, and misery. And outside Europe, it has already begun. Perhaps you expected me to talk about Indonesia or Congo, two countries that I've studied for years and that have taught me so much. Perhaps you would have hoped that I talked about colonialism, about the measure of guilt and responsibility we have in this regard. Well, indeed, yes. Let us talk about colonialism today. Let us talk about guilt and responsibility. And let us talk about the role of the West. But not just retrospectively, not just by looking over our shoulders towards the past. Because even when we fully come to terms with the colonization of historical times, we still haven't done anything about the dramatic way in which we are now colonizing the future. Humanity appropriates this century with the same ruthlessness, the same greed, and the same short-sightedness that characterized the way in which continents were seized on in the past. Colonialism is no longer a strictly territorial, but also a temporal thing. And we are behaving like the colonizers of future generations. We are depriving them of their freedom, their health, possibly even their lives. We burden future generations with our own selves, and we do so with astounding brutality and indifference. We act as if they won't be there, as if their land is ours, as if their world is empty, as if we are free to dip into their resources, potable water, fertile soil, healthy air, forgetting that they too might need them. We plunder our grandchildren, we rob our children, we poison our offspring. But now this is happening so fast that we are beginning to feel the consequences ourselves. Forest fires, floods, and water shortages have become our salvation, apparently. It is too cynical for words, but it is only now that we are waking up. It is only now that we are taking action. It's only now that we are realizing that things cannot go on like this. The Flemish Minister for Mobility, Lydia Peters, recently said so in so many words, and I quote, "The water bomb that fell on Wallonia in the French-speaking part of Belgium last summer has jolted us awake." End quote. And we say we and us as if the whole humanity were responsible. And it sounds friendly and considerate and inclusive. We, humanity, we are collectively responsible for global warming, and we're all in the same boat now. But this phrasing conceals a much deeper truth, one we don't want to see, because we are not in the same boat, and we are not equally responsible. Global warming has been, and still is, mainly caused by the richest nations in the temperate regions of the planet, and is mainly felt by the poorest countries in the tropics. This change from subject to object occurs somewhere around the Tropic of Cancer. Once you've crossed it, you've entered the accusative. From there on, you undergo the behavior of the other. It's like passive smoking. You didn't ask for it, but you suffer the consequences nonetheless. So shall we talk about colonialism beyond colonialism? All right. The countries of the South are the passive smokers inhaling the Northern Hemisphere smoke, mainly coming from the temperate regions. No, it's even worse. The countries from the South suffer more than the smokers themselves. Those countries that emit the lowest amounts of greenhouse gases are the most vulnerable to their harmful effects. We are not only colonizing the future, we are colonizing the South. The carbon footprint of a 15-year-old shepherd boy from Chad is next to nothing, but he'll see his country turn into an even bigger desert as a result of the lifestyles of his peers in Washington, Tokyo, or Amsterdam. And once his goats have died of hunger and thirst, and he decides to move to more moderate regions where the heat is tolerable for most months of the year, well, a long ordeal of migration, discrimination, and disintegration awaits him. Whatever he does, it'll be misery. Decolonizing the mind? Absolutely, yes. But more importantly, we should be decolonizing the heat. Western countries today devote remarkable amounts of energy to discussions over street names and public statues. A suitable way of dealing with the colonial past is in the news almost every week. But the discussion about this much more widespread, much more current type of colonialism has hardly begun. Yet we have to talk about it. We have to talk about the hurricanes that hit Mozambique in 2019. A country that hardly emits any greenhouse gases itself. Yet more than 3 million of its inhabitants lost their homes or became victims in other ways. We have to talk about the famine that broke out in Madagascar last year, the first in the world to be proven to be caused by a warmer climate. We have to talk about the slums of Jakarta that are now flooded. Climate change is all too often presented as something that threatens nature in the far north. And we keep seeing these images of crumbling glaciers or lonely polar bears on tiny icebergs. But climate change also concerns people in the tropics, like the old fishermen in Kiribati, Samoa and Vanuatu who see their islands disappear, or the young mothers in Bangladesh whose coastal villages has been washed away. It is estimated that in Bangladesh alone, 18 million people will have to flee due to the rising sea levels in the next 30 years. That is more than the entire population of the Netherlands. If we really want to develop a post-colonial world, we'll have to go beyond campaigning against local symbols of the past and start fighting global structures of the present. If we really want to decolonize the mind, we'll also have to talk about bodies, such as those of 12-year-old boys dying of heat beside their emaciated cows, and those of their peers who have the air conditioning set at 16 degrees Celsius while watching influencers on TikTok showing hip, disposable clothes stitched by children in the sweatshops of the South. If we really want to make progress, we'll need to reinvent global solidarity. Some people have suffered greatly in the past, and their children and grandchildren still feel the pain. Others haven't realized that this pain exists or haven't sufficiently recognized it. We can only work on the future in the present if the past is no longer an open wound. This requires dialogue, however difficult. It requires humility, empathy, and patience. And it requires the will and courage to move forwards together, exactly in the way Maya Angelou wrote in her powerful and famous poem. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Beautiful words. And in that process, safe spaces can help, absolutely, if only to take a breather, because the struggle will be long and hard. At the same time, we must also work on universal responsibility, as the Dalai Lama calls it, if we are to face the planetary challenges that lie ahead of us. We are colonizing the future, and we have a crushing responsibility in this respect. Western countries have been polluting for much longer, and have polluted more heavily. China came later, but today it pollutes the most. In post-colonial discussions, there is a regular call for reparations. And the question is, of course, understandable. The West has enriched itself at the expense of the colonies, so shouldn't money finally flow back? Yet how this should be done is far from being clear. How far back in time do you need to go? How do you calculate profit and loss? How do you determine whether current poverty is entirely due to the colonial time or also to later regimes? And is there any point at all in making reparations to countries that have corrupt leaders today who will pocket the money? These are difficult questions, and these are only the practical ones. There are also some moral questions. Who are Western countries doing it for? For themselves or for others? And do they want to ease their own conscience, or do they really want to help others? And do they think they can solve this with money again? Could it backfire? Because the experience Europe has with large-scale reparations isn't always positive. The last time they were imposed was on Germany after the First World War. During the 1920s and 30s, ever larger parts of German society experienced the reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, not only as a burden, but increasingly as a humiliation. The rest is history. Today, too, the aim for recovery may reap resentment. Reparations can perpetuate the circle of retribution. Perhaps we can learn more from post-Second War Germany, the country that didn't have to undergo large-scale reparations, but undertook an in-depth, decade-long national examination of conscience, a thorough but serene Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with its dark past. And that effort was combined with an equally humble and generous stance in international politics. Very impressive. And this might be the attitude that former colonial powers could adopt. They should be humble, but without indulging in historical navel-gazing. They should be deeply aware of the past, yet at the same time truly responsible for the future. And yes, that could involve money, definitely. But rather than punishing younger generations for the misdeeds of the past, it might be more constructive if Western countries contributed generously to the international funds to fight climate change in the tropics. For years now, the United Nations has been striving for a large emergency fund to assist poor countries during the climate crisis. In Paris in 2015, it was agreed that the fund would be worth $100 billion annually. But 5 years later, it appears that the rich countries haven't kept their promise at all. Yet the former colonizers should be the first to put substantial amounts of money in the pot. They owe it both to themselves, to their past, and to the world. The Netherlands and my own country, Belgium, have been polluting since the 19th century. And that's why we need to reduce our emissions faster than the rest. The Netherlands and Belgium have both had colonies and owe part of their prosperity to them. That's why we should contribute generously to the international climate funds for the Global South, and do it now. That is better than making present and future generations pay the fines of the previous tenants. Colonial culpability is not hereditary, but colonial privilege is. And this calls for awareness. This calls for responsibility. We, the younger generations, we did not choose this past, but we can choose another future. We can show that we've learned from the mistakes of the past. We can restore the broken world that we have inherited by working together to create a fairer and more sustainable and juster world. Dear friends, so far I've been speaking mainly about what countries can do against colonizing the future. But we all know that countries have their limitations, that they sometimes find it difficult to form a government, for example, as you and I, as Dutch and Belgians, are well aware of. We know that they sometimes find it difficult to reach decisions, as we see every day. And we know that sometimes they find it very hard to reach consensus at international assemblies. Because at international forums such as the EU, the UN, or the COP conferences, countries almost always think as countries, rarely as global actors. In that sense, countries behave exactly like political parties at a national level. They recognize the general interest, for sure, but at the end of the day, self-interest prevails. And that is why multilateral diplomacy often resembles national party politics. It is, therefore, a suboptimal system that rewards greed and punishes maturity. During international summits, national delegations always seem to think, fine, but how are we going to explain this to the home front? During national discussions, political parties often think, how are we going to explain this compromise to our voters? There's always this fear that their supporters back home won't like a possible compromise. And this is why, after more than 70 years of solid climate science, there is still such an appallingly large gap between what experts know and what politicians do. And this tragedy was once aptly described by Flemish Environment Minister Bruno Tobak, when he said, and I quote, "Almost every politician knows what to do to tackle the climate problem, but there is no politician who knows how to get elected afterwards." End quote. Now, if politicians' fear of their voters runs so deep, there's basically two things you can do. Either water down the necessary measures until you hope your voters will accept them, or involve the voters themselves in creating climate policies. Weakening policies or involving citizens. Those are the two options. And the latter is more promising. Recent pioneering research done by two young political science professors, Canadian Michael Mackenzie and Belgian Didier Caluards, has shown that ambitious climate policies can be achieved much faster if citizens are involved themselves. The latter won't be condemned to a role as passive spectators, but will instead become active players. The large gap between what science knows and what politicians fail to do, this gap can be bridged by what citizens decide. I would now like to discuss 4 ways in which citizens can be actively involved. Firstly, a citizens' assembly followed by a preferendum. And I'll start with an example. Between October 2019 and June 2020, French President Macron asked a cross-section of the French population, a diverse citizens' assembly consisting of 150 members, how they would, in the spirit of social justice, reduce French greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. And that was the beginning of the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, the Citizens' Convention on the Climate, which today is still the most spectacular example of a climate assembly consisting of citizens drawn by lot. For many months, these 150 participants had discussions with each other. They had time to invite experts, to learn and to listen. They developed proposals, and in the end, they handed their report to President Macron. Their report contained 149 ambitious measures to tackle climate change. They were quite different and diverse, such as lower the VAT on train tickets, make the French fishing fleet sustainable, limit the use of air conditioners, impose better protection on French forests, make ecocide a punishable offence, amend the preamble to the Constitution, etc. 149 of them. If anyone still doubted the ability of citizens to develop bold policies, here was the proof. And although Macron orally promised to submit their proposals sans filtre, without filters, to the competent authorities, the proposals received a rather lukewarm reception. Only 15 of them were converted unfiltered into policies. 55 were modified or weakened, and no less than 79, therefore, proposals were rejected, more than half of the work. So a meaningful intellectual effort by random citizens turned into a huge disappointment. The French even took to the streets because the majority of society, left and right-wing alike, largely agreed with the Convention's work. Now, how could this have been avoided? This waste of energy, this waste of work. Now imagine that President Macron hadn't passed the report with the recommendations to the competent authorities, but had put them to the national population in the form of a preferendum. A preferendum is a rich type of referendum. Instead of answering yes or no to a question posed by politicians, in a preferendum, citizens are allowed to evaluate proposals that have been written and drafted by fellow citizens, and that changes everything. 149 is of course a very large number, but all proposals could have been put into a carousel that generates lists of 30 proposals per voter. And each proposal could even be accompanied by a paragraph of explanation written by the Citizens' Assembly. And so each French citizen could tick whether they completely agreed, disagreed, strongly disagreed with each of these proposals. And finally, they could even indicate which 5 themes they considered most important to them. The Preferendum, therefore, is an interesting and safe instrument for combining and clustering individual preferences into collective priorities. The new Dutch government could follow the example of France, but enriched by a preferendum in order to assess public support for the measures. Ideally, this process, a citizens' assembly followed by a preferendum, would take place annually to determine the public's priorities. In the Netherlands, for instance, on Prinsjesdag, Budget Day, not only the financial budget, but also the carbon budget could be announced. And the Prime Minister, for instance, could say, this year we're still allowed so many gigatons of emissions. How are we going to do this? Citizens' Assembly, get to work. Citizens take part in the preferendum, and government act upon their recommendations. This would actively engage the majority of the national population in the desired climate policy, and it would reduce the gap between citizens and politicians. And it would, most importantly, take away the fear of voters, because these voters would now have become active citizens involved with developing climate strategies. The second proposal is called the Global Assembly. Even if every country were to organize an annual citizens' assembly followed by a preferendum, countries would still think like countries at the international level. And that's why we also need a form of citizens' assembly at the global level. Because what we have today in terms of international decision-making and the bodies we have for that invariably remains limited to a dialogue between states. It is literally no more than an international dialogue, an interstate dialogue. All what we have in terms of global bodies are merely interstate forms of cooperation with a more or less coercive character. Luckily, we do have the United Nations, but it's no more than that. United Nations, a union of nations. Where can the world's population speak as a world population? Where can the Earth's inhabitants shape the future of this Earth together? The answer is nowhere. That place simply doesn't exist. We all live on this one small, fragile Earth, but we have no forum to talk about it together. The world is like a country with only local authorities. Our common government is a collection of mayors. Is it any wonder then that local interests are always paramount? But maybe I am mistaken, because we do have such a forum. It's still very modest, it's still in its infancy, but its potential is huge. Last October, the very first Global Assembly was held, a bottom-up initiative that received the explicit support of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and COP26 Chairman Alok Sharma. With the help of NASA, a random sample of 100 dots was plotted on a map of the world, partly based on population density. At each of these dots, the organizers of the Global Assembly looked for a local partner to select 4 to 6 ordinary citizens through conversations in the street or door-to-door recruitment. And in order to achieve a balance in terms of age, gender, place of residence, education level, and attitude to climate change, a final group of 100 participants was drafted by lot from this pool of 600 plus people. The organizers, and I spoke to some of them, acknowledged that the number of 100 participants was far too low to be representative of the 7 billion people on Earth, of course. But with a budget of $1 million, they did what they could. And their aim is to have 1,000 participants next time and to make this a regular feature. At the recent COP26 conference in Glasgow, the interim recommendations were announced, and you can read the final report on their website, globalassembly.org. Whether these recommendations will have much impact in the short term is uncertain. But the organization has the ambition of involving 10 million people annually by 2030. 10 million people. That's a lot. Suppose this annual Global Assembly were to take place in September, when the annual General Assembly of the United Nations convenes in New York. Now, that would bring voters, that would bring people of the world to the forefront. For the first time in history, the world would speak as the world. My third proposal concerns individualized emission rights. It's the longest of the 4. The first 2 proposals dealt with the question how citizens should participate in deciding the desired climate policy. The third one is about how they should act. Because today this acting is too individual and non-committal. Those who want to can eat less meat or fly less often or spend less time on their a hot shower, but that is not enough. At best, it's a drop in the ocean. At worst, it turns climate policy into some lifestyle choice, something that can be flaunted and that others can dismiss while cutting another slice of their T-bone steak. No, this should be done better. Imagine that every Monday morning you receive 100 carbon credits from the government on your phone, bank card, or public transport pass, regardless of your age, lifestyle, or whatever other criterion. And everyone in your country would get them, starting on their 18th birthday. It would be like a kind of universal basic income, but not in euros, but in carbos, which makes it affordable for the government. And you don't have to use these units very often, only when you buy fossil fuels. That is, when you pay your gas or electricity bill, or when you fill up your car. In addition to the normal amount of euros, you would also have to pay an amount in carbos. If you fill up with 50 liters of petrol, let's say, 50 units are deducted from your individual carbon wallet. And the units that you don't use, for instance, because you don't have a car, you can sell at any time. A few taps on your phone, and there you go, you've made a few quid. It could even amount to a few hundred euros a month, depending on your behavior and the market value of carbos at the time of sale. Because the units that you have just sold, they would end up in a virtual marketplace and would be added to those of other sellers. And there, the law of supply and demand applies. And now it gets interesting because the government also supplies this public marketplace with large numbers of units. After all, companies and governments need to buy their carbon credits from this marketplace. They do not get them for free. And thus, companies and governments are therefore stimulated to use as little fossil fuel as possible. And the money raised by the public sale of these virtual carbon credits could be used by governments to insulate the houses of the poorest as soon as possible and to finance other aspects of a just transition. That would be an added bonus. Yet the best thing of this scheme is that the amount of carbon credits to start with, the amount that is put into circulation each year, would be determined in advance by an independent public body responsible for the climate. A little bit like the European Central Bank deciding how much money to issue. If we need to achieve, say, a 4% reduction in 2022 to reach our targets in 2030 and 2050, we would know exactly how many carbon credits we can still spend. In short, we would cut our coat according to our cloth. We would act on what we have, not on what we want. With this model, we can be certain we'll reach the intended targets, because they are at the start of the whole process. And that's why this scheme is a much better plan than the popular proposal to put a price on carbon emissions. Because the thinking there is that if emissions become more expensive, everyone will reduce them. But this reasoning was also used in the fight against tobacco. If we make cigarettes more expensive, people will automatically quit. But in practice, smokers did not quit. They often kept on smoking and saved on other expenses. Raising prices only leads very partially to a change in behavior. Besides, if you make carbon emissions simply more expensive, you punish the poor and spare the rich, while the system of carbon credits and individualized emission rights actually helps the poor and inhibits the rich. The model that I'm sketching here was developed by British economist, cultural historian and thinker David Fleming. He called these individual emission rights tradable energy quotas, or tax, which has become the technical term TEQ. And at first, it may sound a little bit complicated, but in essence, it is no more difficult than the VAT system that was introduced in the Netherlands or Belgium in about 1970. The British Parliament had shown interest in these texts. About 10 years ago, it even published a report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Peak Oil, whose chairman, John Hemming, wrote, and I quote, "I believe texts provide the fairest and most productive way to deal with the oil crisis and to simultaneously guarantee reductions in fossil fuel use to meet climate change targets," unquote. Around the same time, though, David Fleming died unexpectedly in Amsterdam, actually, which marked the end of his brilliant scheme. And it was forgotten for almost a decade. But a peer-reviewed article in Nature published last summer made a new case for his proposal. And in August last year, Dutch economics professor Barbara Baarsma and IBM employee Leo Dijkstra wrote an opinion piece in the newspaper Trouw, in which they too advocated individual emission rights. And the title was a summary, and it said, "Involve citizens in a positive way in dealing with the climate by letting them manage their own emissions." So this is probably the big idea that everyone's waiting for. My fourth and final proposal is grimmer and hopefully unnecessary. I advocate it rather reluctantly, but when we talk about the active role of citizens, we do need to think about it. It's called civil disobedience. Every citizen of every country is supposed to know the laws of their country and to act accordingly. But there comes a point when the laws are no longer defensible because they conflict with justice, dignity, or life itself. We are fast approaching this point. In recent decades, our governments have shown extraordinary negligence in protecting the lives of their citizens, safeguarding their territory, and guaranteeing a viable future. The Dutch, Belgian, German, French, and Irish governments have all been condemned in no uncertain terms for their policies by their respective judicial authorities. In the Netherlands, the Dutch went so far as to impose concrete, quantified reduction targets. And in France, the government was told that it had to repair the damage done. It's a triumph for the rule of law that such rulings are possible. But it is a disaster for society when those national governments still willfully fail to do what needs to be done. So far, I've given 3 ways in which citizens can constructively help their governments in these difficult times, both in terms of decision-making and in terms of decision implementation. My fourth option is more drastic. When Henry David Thoreau was asked to pay his taxes to the state of Massachusetts during his stay at his forest cabin at Walden Pond in 1846, he had been refusing to do so for 6 years because slavery still prevailed in America and because of the continuing war with Mexico. As a result, he was put in jail for a night. Afterwards, he wrote his essay, Civil Disobedience, which is perhaps one of the most influential political texts of the last 200 years. Through Gandhi, the text led to the independence of India. Through Martin Luther King, it inspired the American Civil Rights Movement. And through Rachel Carson, it influenced the international environmental movement. Rosa Parks knew it. Sometimes you need to take a seat on the bus where you're not legally allowed to sit, but you do it anyway, because the law is wrong. Unjust laws exist, Thoreau wrote in his plain cabin in the quiet woods. Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them? He added. If our nations continue to invest in fossil fuels, if they continue to protect the aviation and shipping industries as they do today, if a devastating agricultural industry continues to attract colossal subsidies, if government employees' pensions continue to be invested in fossil funds, if lease cars or company cars continue to be promoted as a cheap form of remuneration, if polluting multinationals continue to have free rein unless citizens take them to court, if kerosene remains untaxed and ecocide goes unpunished, if we continue to confuse welfare with purchasing power or happiness with growth, in short, if our government continues to colonize the future with our tax money, continues to attack the South, continues to devastate nature and exterminate species, won't there come a time when we should ask ourselves, can we, in all conscience, continue to support this? Do we want to continue sponsoring this annihilation of ourselves, of the world, of the future? Shouldn't we begin to calculate how much of our tax money is actually financing our own destruction? I can imagine a few citizens and experts joining forces to determine that percentage. I can imagine that over time they'll build a website where they indicate annually what percentage of national government spending, lending and investment is no good. I can imagine that they will declare themselves conscientious objectors. If 18% of public funds, for instance, is spent on fossil fuel, they'll deduct 18% from their taxes. They'll continue to pay the rest, of course, because the welfare state, the rule of law, and education are dear to them. In their own lives, they'll strive to leave as small a carbon footprint as possible. And on their website, thousands or tens of thousands of supporters will join the initiative and anonymously declare their tax contribution over the previous year. And if you would subtract 18% from this total, you'll get a pretty good idea of what it would mean. A counter would keep track of how much money the government could lose if it doesn't change its policies. For the time being, the commitment of supporters will be symbolic only, but over time, participants could resort to actual fiscal disobedience. And the money that they don't pay to the government would be put into a fund to pay for possible legal costs. Such a movement could develop into a modern form of collective resistance. But hopefully, this won't be necessary. Hopefully, we'll see evidence of decisive government and courageous politics in the years to come. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to loyally cooperate with citizens' assemblies, preferendums, individual emission rights, and other proposals. Hopefully, our will to help will be noticed sooner than our willingness to strike. But before we say goodbye, dear friends, let us think for a few seconds about the species we have lost in the last hour. I thank you very much. And I add some warm thanks to Josien Pieterse from Frame of Frame for the invitation. Thanks to Susan Ridder for the translation. And also thanks to Meta Knol, with whom I'll be now having a conversation.
David, thank you so much for this lecture.
I'm going to take a sip.
Yes, you can take a sip now. And for the people at home, if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. I believe I have to talk that way, yes. And I will have a regular look at my phone and see what's in there and to answer your question. But to start, David, with a very brief question, I think, which is why? Why does it matter so much to you? I was wondering, because I think you also quoted or referred to Johan Huizinga's book Violated World earlier, written in 1945, in which he writes about the beauty of nature. And it might be that there's some essence there about what the meaning of life is.
Oh, for sure.
And I was wondering, but you could also think, oh, well, okay, we're living now, après nous le déluge. Why does it matter so much? So what's the essence of your quest? From a personal perspective.
I don't even have children, but I care deeply for this world because I love it with all its, dark sides. There are quite a few, but the beauty of nature, the beauty of moral behavior, the love of the world, amor mundi, as Hannah Arendt used to call it, is what drives me, and I can only hope that future generations will still have the opportunity to enjoy the beautiful sides of living on this planet. And I'm very, very fearsome of taking that away from them.
Yes, thank you. So this morning, in the Volkskrant, the Dutch journalist Bas Mesters published a letter to the new cabinet.
Okay.
In the Netherlands, finally we have a new cabinet. And he refers to 4 decades of neoliberalism, and he states that this government is proposing huge investments to overcome some of the problems you have been addressing, but yet there is no sign of any systemic change. So what's the real change here? And also his article might be interesting for you because it's also a plea for the Citizens' Council model.
All right.
And well, we have now a new cabinet. There's some good news there because they're also proposing a generational test, generatietoets, in order to test whether decisions that are being made actually are also beneficial for future generations. And for the first time in the Netherlands, we will have a Minister of Climate. So what do you think? What do you expect from this, or what do you hope from this new?
I didn't read the piece by Bas Mesters, although I know him and I appreciate his work a lot. And I didn't read the government deal either, but I read summaries of it. There is clear climate ambition in this new government, at least on paper. And I think this should be applauded. But rather than sitting back and wait, I think Dutch citizens should stand up and say, like, we're willing to help. This is a hell of a job you're embarking upon. Let us know if we can help. The whole idea that citizens are some customers of what government performs, and at the end of the journey, by the next election we'll evaluate them, I think is a very passive and a very neoliberal definition of citizenship. Citizens can play much more active roles, and the Dutch government is entering now this just transition, which you can conceive as a bit of a tunnel. And we're only at the beginning of the tunnel. And what we're seeing now are ways of picking the low-hanging fruit. Most of it has been picked by now. We've reached the point that tougher decisions will have to be made. And this is particularly difficult for elected politicians, as they are always trying to find a balance between long-term interest and the short-term imperative of winning the next election. So there's always a trade-off. So we could definitely help politicians by saying, like, okay, you do have, you know the matter better than we do perhaps, but we are free. We don't have to be elected. We don't have to be re-elected. So the idea, Macron's idea of this citizens' assembly, even on an annual basis, imagine that 150 Dutch citizens would come together for a period of 6 months, and every month they would spend 1 weekend together, and they could invite experts, they could learn, they could come up with recommendations, and this would be given, their report would be given in a preferendum. It would be a very powerful tool helping the Dutch government to see what is priority and what is not.
Yeah. Okay, David. You made that point very clear, I think, also in your lecture. And yet I'm thinking that our political system and our neoliberal society is very much based on a system of high control, low trust, a top-down political system. And us activists, scientists, artists, citizens, we're calling for systemic change, which reveals that we're focused on change as a kind of mechanical perspective, that we can actually design the change and then execute it. And I've recently been reading this little book by Rebecca Solnit, Hope in the Dark, and she says actually something really different. She says that history proves that change is messy, it's chaotic, it's unpredictable. She compares this to the invisible fungus underground.
Like
you
a
know,
rhizome,
that's there.
like
it's there. It's like a sleeping giant.
Yeah.
And she says civic action is like that sleeping giant. And then suddenly, whew, it all comes up. And then change spreads like a virus, she says, which is
from the fungus to the virus. I like
it.
it.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So invisible but profound change that takes place without us really noticing. And she is also talking about what I like very much about inspirational activism. And then she writes about the power of stories, the power of narratives, the power of culture, of course. And then that change, that kind of change is improvisational. It's creative. It's anti-ideological. It's even anarchist. It's based on trust, openness, exchange. It's communal. It's very much connected to a sense of belonging, to movement. And of course it has a strong agency. So I was wondering if you're proposing your 4 proposals, the citizens' assemblies, the global assembly, the carbon credits, the first 3 of them, aren't they more in the realm of the mechanical, predictable change? And how do you look at, I mean, we're here at Frame of Frame in a cultural environment. How do you look at culture and the power of stories?
I think the world of culture is a wonderful laboratory for thinking and imagining the future. And making abstract, scholarly, academic notions, political ideas tangible and visual and putting on the scene. So the arts are an incredible powerhouse for fostering innovative thinking and imaginative thinking. That's why I was so happy with the invitation to come and talk here today. At the same time, I learned a lot from Chantal Mouffe, who is this Belgian political philosopher who works at the University of Westminster in London, where she says, like, well, you should have 1 foot on the pavement and 1 foot on the carpet of the institutions. It's a bit of an uncomfortable position, but I do believe that I quite agree with what Rebecca Solnit writes, that indeed change is messy. It's like a rhizome, it's like a fungus. It lives underground, but it's important to feed it with ideas, with innovative thinking. And at the same time, it's also important to share the joy of innovation, the joy of fresh thinking with people who are so busy with the dashboard of society. Our political leaders, our top civil servants, our judges, etc. That it would be a pity not granting them the opportunity to relish the pleasure of new ideas. It's not. There's a lot of political unwill. I mean, there's no doubt about it. There's ignorance as well. The political will is growing, by the way. I've been personally involved with the 2 places on Earth where a permanent citizens' assembly has been created. First, the German-speaking part of Belgium, which is very small but an interesting laboratory. And now that model was copied in the city of Paris. Last summer, I was invited as an expert in Paris to design the first major permanent citizens' assembly in the world for the capital of the world's fifth economy. I mean, that's quite something. A city of more than 2 million inhabitants. So doors are opening there as well. And I think I would be a little bit wary of a activist model that keeps all the fun and the joy of innovative thinking within the realm of activists, artists, citizens, scholars, academics, and having a refusal to go and talk to politicians.
Yeah.
They're people too. And most politicians I know, I don't know that many of them, most of them are working incredibly hard for very little impact. It's a frustrating job. And so I do realize that some of my ideas is like a long shot for them. I mean, they're thinking about next week, and I'm talking about 2050. But I do believe that many of them, and especially younger politicians, or those young at heart, are getting interested in these innovative ideas. But I think what I see is that they're working so hard on their job or getting re-elected among the more cynical ones, that it becomes sometimes hard to find time for innovative thinking. So that's part of our job as well.
Yeah. But then at the same time, if you don't make it, if it doesn't happen that way, if it doesn't go fast enough, then there's the fourth option of civil disobedience. And I was wondering, because you refer to Thoreau, mid-19th century, who wrote on civil disobedience, in the sense that if injustice is at stake, then the right of the individual to go beyond the government is there. And of course, I perfectly understand that, and you made it pretty clear in your lecture too. But I couldn't help also seeing this in the perspective of the American ideal of liberty and of the freedom of the individual against the state, anti-democratic, anti-tax. I mean, he did that, and he was in a certain way anti-democratic himself. And we are living in a time when, especially in America, I mean, democracy is so much being contested at this time. So I was wondering, given this dichotomy between, the vulnerability of our democratic system on the one hand, and then the need and the urge to shift towards civil disobedience. How do you deal with that dichotomy, and where is for you the tipping point or the point of no return that you think, what's your personal turning point? When would you actually do that?
I did not call to stop paying taxes. What I called for was, let's start calculating how much of our tax money is no good and goes into fossil dangers. Because we don't know that figure. And it's an incredible, complicated calculus. And I'm not an economist myself, or a fiscal expert myself, or a budget expert. But I think people should sit together and figure out. I am a staunch Democrat. I do believe in democracy, but I also do believe in democracy for the future. So, where is the tipping point? I think if you see governments now showing goodwill in terms of, planning substantial efforts in terms of entering this tunnel of the just transition, I think we should support that. And we should be cooperative in the ways I have indicated. At the same time, it's a bit like the good cop, bad cop principle. You need pressure at the same time. All activism consists of a moderate wing and a more militant wing. And in order to make sure that the moderate wing makes some advances, the militant wing needs to make some noise. And so I think that might be useful strategically to combine these two. Personally, I find it difficult. I do not mind paying my taxes at all, and I'm in a country with the highest tax rates of Europe. I do not mind. But I do mind knowing that part of that money is going into the destruction of my future and that of future generations. I find that morally objectionable. And when the moment will have come that it is no longer defendable what is happening, and if you don't see any serious efforts that take into account what we know from what scientists tell us, from what the IPCC tells us, I'll be the first one not to pay my taxes for that fragment, for sure. Throw me in jail.
Throw me. Oh boy, I hope you won't be the only one not paying taxes. Another thing, another question. When you delivered the Huizingalezing in Leiden in December, I believe it was December 12. After that, a review appeared in in a Belgian newspaper, The Standaard. Have you read it? It was by Meta Knol.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Very good. And I believe you wisely adjusted your lecture after her response. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Oh, it was, I got some comments on choice of vocabulary.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with in a more solemn way, and so I used the traditional ladies and gentlemen, which I don't do in English that often anymore, but in Dutch there's not a really good equivalent. But I adapted that because I don't think it was inclusive enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of my talk was also written from a sense of frustration in post-colonial discourse, in that I see so much energy going into debates on what I called the symbolic, the fights against the symbols of the past.
Yes, like the street names,
like
you
street
said,
names,
and the public statues,
yeah.
and why waste our energy on that kind of symbols?
If
well, we have such a huge
yeah.
task when it comes to the future. Yeah.
I mean, I endorse that. I mean, of course, I endorse the movement for decolonizing the mind. I mean, I've written a major book on Congo and Indonesia, and especially on the decolonization movement there. So I think there's important work to be done there, and let's continue that work.
Okay.
But sometimes it frustrates me, given that for the past 4 or 5 years, I started to read quite intensively into climate science. And it's what lies ahead of us. We're so close to the abyss. It's so urgent that sometimes if I see all the energy going into a discussion on public statues, I think, oh, if only 10% of that energy could go into another form of injustice, which is another form of colonialism, the colonialism of the future, I'd be very happy. And so I think there was a bit of impatience in my text.
Yeah.
And Merel Wenselaar pointed it out in her text, and we talked about it for 2 hours afterwards. And it was a really interesting exchange. I mean, it's always interesting to learn from your critics. And so I thought it was really, really interesting to realize that, there's the impatience knowing the reports of the IPCC, and at the same time, there's a sort of strategic patience to make sure everyone is still on the same page.
Yes, yes.
And so that's why for today, for instance, and also in the book publication, I toned down some of my impatience.
Yes, yes.
But the impatience is the result of deep worry.
Yes.
That's
and
it.
Yes, and the acknowledgement that we're all in this boat together in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
There was this article by George Monbiot this week when he had seen the movie Don't Look Up.
Yes, I've read it too in The Guardian.
In The Guardian.
Yeah.
You read it too?
Yeah.
And I understood him so very well.
Yeah.
When he said like the sense of despair that he has and that I experience every day, it makes for a lot of impatience.
Yes, which is why I also was thinking it's easy to have this, to talk about the enemy, like the state doesn't do it right, or huge companies like Shell or Unilever or whatever, not doing it right. But maybe it isn't politics or industry or the media, it's us. You know, it's us consumers.
Of course.
It's us being addicted to this neoliberal capitalist system of consuming. It's the growth addiction that we're all, sort of part of. So how about that? Because if your trust in citizens seems really high, but I think in history proves that political systems can be turned upside down by civil action and civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, but the difference this time is that it's us.
Yeah.
We are our own enemies.
Well, for the past 40 years, we've been mostly treated as consumers in
Yes.
every aspect of public life, at universities, in healthcare, even in politics. We're like consumers of political parties, and our voting behavior is like a purchasing moment. We have been treated as consumers, and we have to learn to become citizens again. We're talking about civil disobedience at a time of massive consumerist obedience. You look at the long queues in front of Primark.
Yeah.
It's the opium of the people.
Yeah.
And so we definitely need to become citizens again. And I think there are many ways to do so. Activism, art, I mean, you've mentioned quite a few. But one of the best schools of re-becoming a citizen are citizens' assemblies. We see it so often. Yeah. People who are drafted in these citizens' assemblies go through a transformative experience. From passive voters, they become active citizens. Yeah. And I remember, for instance, there was an article in Der Spiegel on the German-speaking part of Belgium, following the first collective, the first permanent citizens' assembly. And there was this one man, elderly white male, former truck driver, I believe, who declared himself to be an extremist voter. And the journalist of Der Spiegel had been following him and how he was transformed throughout the process. And the title, or the lead of the article was, Das Ergebnis ist verblüffend. The result is astonishing. To see what it could do. All of a sudden, he had a sense of belonging, which he hadn't had for most of his life. Yes, a sense of belonging within the family, but not within society. And so the moment citizens come to realize that, hang on, society is us, and we can make a fist, or we can come up with better ideas, or we can define policies, it's a transformative experience.
Yeah. Well, we need a lot of those transformative experiences, and that's why I think all kinds of ways.
Yeah, and it's going to take a while, and we don't have that much time anymore. No. And that's why I think the Preferendum, it's a sort of interesting intermediate form. I mean, it's still individual and it's still ticking boxes, but at least you help shaping national policies.
Engaged citizenship.
That's it.
I have a question from the audience. Thank you very much. The first one is from Meta Knol. What role do you think museums or other public institutions should take up with regard to the climate crisis? Should they prioritize public dialogue to raise awareness, or rather directly act by facilitating civil disobedience?
Interesting. Thank you for that question, Menno. I think museums will or can perform quite a number of functions. Indeed, informative exhibits. I think it's only now that the topic of climate change is becoming part of the modern art scene. For a very long time, it's been quite silent in the arts. So that's why I'm so happy that Frame of Frame has this wonderful exhibit by De Souza and Jonas Staal here. Because this is a real engagement with the big issues that is at stake. So yes, please let the big museums continue the work that Frame of Frame and other galleries are doing. I think it's important. I think helping organize civic disobedience, interesting, hadn't thought about it. I also think that museums might play a very important role in terms of consolation. We are going to need beauty as well. Times ahead will become dark. There will be very tough moments, and I don't think we'll be able to live them without the joy, the pleasure, the sheer intellectual excitement, and even the emotional and moral consolation that great art can procure, and even perhaps the encouragement to step out in the real world and take up your work again. So I think they can perform quite a number of functions.
Thank you, Matt. I have a few more.
Okay.
Two more from Sophia. Hi, Sophia. Here's your question. I would like to ask about apathy. Most people are aware of the current problems, but I experience what seems like a lot of apathy. Mm-hmm. People continue to enjoy their privileges while knowing the implications of that. What are your thoughts on this, and what could help to change this? Like, we're us consumers running into the light, like.
And she talks about personal apathy, right?
Yeah, personal apathy. Yeah.
I understand.
Knowing, not acting,
No.
something like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
the powerlessness we all experience leads to despair and even apathy. I think it's a very normal reaction, which we should acknowledge and accept somehow. At the same time, it is not too late. I learned a lot from a Belgian professor, Professor Van Ieperzele, who was the vice president of the IPCC. And on his jacket sleeve, he always had a badge, like one of these badges, and it said, never, never, never give up. And I think it's important. In moments of apathy, please have them, acknowledge them, but also think of that badge. And whatever you can do within your personal life or within your professional life or within your families or whatever environment you are finding yourself, there's always some effort that can be done. There's always some conversation that can be struck. There's always some flower that can be enjoyed. It can be small things. But seeing the beauty of nature is perhaps the first step to resistance.
Thank you. Very, very nice. And I think, indeed, if you want that future, you should start living it now, that very future.
I like it, yes, that's beautiful.
There's another one from Klaas. Klaas asks, he wonders, how could we organize this mental space we need for long-term planning when democratic space is going the other direction, like 4 years or even less?
Yeah.
How can we open that dialogue?
Oh, that's obviously a very important question. Fighting climate change is working on the next century or next 80 years or 50 years, long term. Democratic models are inherently myopic. They work on a time frame of 4 to 5 years. So it's difficult. And one of the reasons why I'm such a strong advocate for citizens' assemblies and combined with preferendums is that they help our politicians to get out of their cage. For them it's very, very hard to serve 2050 if you have to win the elections of 2024. And so these citizens' assemblies can be a very powerful instrument. The city of Amsterdam, I am standing here now in Amsterdam, the city has organized just a few weeks ago an interesting a pilot project in terms of a climate citizens council. The proof is in the pudding. We'll see what will be done with the recommendations, but the work that was performed by citizens was really quite extraordinary. And so these are interesting tools to help our politicians serve long-term thinking and long-term acting.
Yes, I think in your lecture you also talked about the fact that politicians are actually afraid of their voters. And by giving their voters a voice that is much more engaged, much more based on knowledge within the context of this citizens' assemblies might be the way to overcome that gap. Huh?
Oh yeah,
If
you treat people as voters, as even voting cattle, as kiesvee, as we say in Dutch, you shouldn't be surprised that they behave as passive consumers. But the moment you treat citizens as adults, they behave as adults.
Yes, of course.
And I can understand for politicians today it's hard because you see all this online shouting and the verbal violence on the social media, etc. So you have the impression that the voter is a sort of irrational being somewhere else in society.
Yeah, yeah.
Some research has been done, it's quite interesting, even by a Dutch scholar, showing that the average politician thinks of themselves as being superior in terms of knowledge, rationality, long-term thinking. So what is really interesting with new forms of climate assemblies or citizen assemblies is in the first round, very often you combine citizens drafted by a lot with politicians, if only to break the ice. And it really works. This was done in Ireland as well. A politician thought like, ooh, citizens, dangerous, irrational creatures. And all of a sudden putting them together made for a form of reconciliation and reconnection.
Yes, I think it's also about redistributing trust.
Yes,
you know, giving up control in a way, and then
every society is like a triangle where you have politicians, citizens, and markets, and that triangle should be in balance. If politicians have too much power, it's an authoritarian model. If citizens have too much power, it's like what we used to call a verzuiling, where the civil society is running all of. And if markets have too much power, you're in a neoliberal model. And so what we have now is that the markets have run away with most of the public power, and the two other ones are just distrusting each other. Politicians and citizens are distrusting each other. And as long as this continues, the markets are having a field day. They're having a ball.
Yeah.
So I think there are new forms of trust between citizens and politicians need to be created, if only to bring markets back into the game.
We'll see about that one, David. I have one more question, and then I guess we'll start wrapping it up.
Markets, sorry to go on with that, but many business leaders now are asking for clear regulations, are asking for legislation. It's not just that they're not wanting it. Many companies are even are begging for frameworks, are even imposing frameworks upon themselves.
Yes, it has been that way ever since the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
You know, a factory owners asking for legislation in order to make sure that the same rules are applicable for everyone. But obviously, in a globalized capitalist system, it works another way. We don't have international laws. I mean, that's why bringing ecocide to the international court in The Hague is so very important,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
That's why that case against the Dutch state or the
Shell case.
The Shell case is so exemplary.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
Okay. David, Huizi asks, societies often only act after disaster happens, not before. For example, the Dutch watersnoodramp.
Yep.
I think here is a lack of action because climate change consequences are not felt widely. Do we need to feel the consequences of climate change more to undertake actions, including civil disobedience, but also at the level of governance?
Well, you talk.
Do we need a disaster?
Well, you talk to somebody coming from a country which lost 41 people just half a year ago during the incredible floods and rainfalls in last July. Earlier this week, I happened to be traveling through that part of the region that was affected. Unbelievable, the scenery, the landscape, the amount of devastation. And so this was felt in Belgium, it was felt in Germany, much less so in the Netherlands. A few years ago, I read an article, I didn't write it myself, I read an article calling cynically for we need some minor disaster to shake things up, to wake people. And I thought, like, let this not be true. But it's true that the quote I gave from this Belgian minister saying, like, and now this has really shaken us, and it's curious. In Belgium, more people have died now of climate change than of terrorism. We had 32 people dying through the Islamist terrorist attacks a few years ago. We have more people dead from the floods last summer. The acting is not as swift and as drastic as happened after the terrorist attacks. But I hope that the Dutch government will learn from the Belgian disaster. And I hope that the Dutch government will also learn from what happened in Germany, where more than 100 people got killed. But I'm not quite sure that next summer we will not see similar forms of disaster in the forms of heat waves or wildfires, which might even strike parts of the Low Countries as well, or floods, massive floods. I mean, weather has become so unpredictable. But I hope that the information, the knowledge, the scholarship we have from all these wonderful scientists filters through where they should be heard. I mentioned Professor Van Reybrouck in an earlier answer. He was on French-speaking Belgian television just after this catastrophe this summer. And it was the first time I saw him in tears. I mean, he's this, staunch academic, climate scientist. And he was reading from the very, very first IPCC report from the 1990s. And it was exactly what had been predicted 30 years ago. Rainfalls, draconic rainfalls, floods in the temperate regions. So please, politicians, do not wait for other victims, other people to die. Act upon what is known and what is solid scholarly evidence.
David, thank you. I think I would like to conclude this lecture and this discussion, questions afterwards, with referring to C.S. Lewis, who said that you can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and
That's
change the ending.
Yeah.
Right? And I believe you said that the future is dark.
Yeah.
You could say that future is always dark. It's always unknown. It's always unpredictable. But you need beams of light in that future through imagination, for example, through engagement, action, inspiration, but most of all imagination. And I think that beam of light of imagination, you gave that with your lecture too. To conclude also with Rebecca Solnit, in her essay, Hope in the Dark, which is a very future-oriented essay, she of course recalls the triumphs of civic action in the past. Because if you can see that in the past, it's a tremendous source of hope and inspiration for the future. It's not only recent past, like Black Lives Matter, of the Zwarte Pieten debate in the Netherlands. It's of course also the abolition of slavery, for example, or the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's those moments of eruption and emancipation when huge shifts happen in society. And also what I like very much about her is that when it comes to human disasters, like also in Belgium, it turns out that people actually are really good in handling those situations by means of empathic action, helping each other. You know, they keep calm, they carry on. So there is, I think, there's some sort of hope in that. And I would like to conclude with a little quote, really brief, by Ursula Le Guin, out of this book. And she writes, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." Thank you, David.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Great quote.
And thank you, all of you at Frame of Frames and all of you behind the screens at home for watching. We're ready. Thanks for watching and hope to see you again live at Frame of Frames or elsewhere in the digital domain. Thanks very much.
Thank you.